I was sold to marry a wealthy millionaire. My story of romance. Emily Carter had never imagined that her life, already fragile and filled with uncertainties, could take such a drastic turn over a single conversation. It was a humid evening in early spring, and the scent of fried food still clung to her skin after a 10-hour shift at Betty's Diner. The place was a small roadside restaurant in a forgotten corner of rural Texas, and though she hated it, it paid just enough to keep her and her parents from total ruin, or so she thought. As she walked through the front door of their worn-out house, a modest one-story with peeling white paint and a porch that creaked louder than her tired bones, she found her parents sitting on the couch in silence. Her mother's hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Her father's eyes locked on the floor as if avoiding a truth too heavy to carry. She barely had time to greet them when her father raised his gaze. "Horse, we need to talk." "Emily," he began, voice. There was something final in those words, something that settled in her stomach like a stone. She sat across from them, instinctively bracing herself. Her father continued, explaining how the hardware business he had tried to revive had failed catastrophically. The debts were not just deep, they were drowning them. Emily already knew the situation was bad, but not this bad. She hadn't realized that the house had been mortgaged a second time, that loan sharks had replaced banks, and that the interest was swallowing them alive. Then came the words that would dismantle every plan she had ever made. "There's someone willing to clear the debt," her father said slowly. "But there's a condition." Emily frowned. "What condition?" "You marry him." She laughed, unsure, whether it was disbelief or desperation that bubbled out of her. This some kind of joke? "What?" Her mother's eyes welled with tears. "It's real, sweetheart. His name is Nathaniel Reed. He's from New York. He offered to settle everything if you agree to a one-year marriage." It was absurd, unreal. A transaction that didn't belong in her life, a plot ripped from a bad novel. But they weren't joking. The man existed. The proposal was official, and her parents had already accepted the offer. Emily stared at them in stunned silence. Her father tried to justify the decision, said it was the only way out, that they were desperate. Her mother added that Nathaniel was wealthy, respectable, known for being discreet, that he wanted a private arrangement, no strings attached beyond the agreed year. "It's not about love," her father clarified. "It's about survival." Emily's hands trembled as she stood up. She walked to her room, closed the door quietly behind her, and slid down against the frame until she was sitting on the cold floor. Her thoughts spiraled. Journalism school was a dream she had nurtured for years. Every shift at the diner, every saved penny had been aimed at that goal. She had never asked for much, just a chance to make her own choices. But now her future was being signed away in exchange for financial relief. And it wasn't just about her anymore, it was about her family, the roof over their heads, their dignity. Her parents had made a deal with a man she had never met, and she was the currency. Emily did not cry that night. She stared at the ceiling, numb until dawn brushed its pale fingers across the curtains. When she finally rose from the floor, her decision was not born from acceptance, but from resignation. If someone had asked her that morning what she wanted in life, she would have said independence, a career. Maybe one day, love. Not a mansion in New York, not a stranger's ring on her finger, not a deal forged in desperation. But choices were, a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked into the kitchen and found her parents already waiting, somber and silent. She nodded once. "I'll do it." And in that moment, she felt the walls close in. Her dreams became collateral, her freedom the price. When she looked into her father's eyes, she knew, whatever came next, it would not be her life she was living. It would be his decision. And when she heard her father whisper, "Thank you," she realized that her own voice didn't matter anymore. Not in this house, not in this life. The name Nathaniel Reed came with an aura of power that hung in the air like static before a storm. Emily first saw it printed in bold letters on a thick envelope her father placed carefully in her hands, as if it contained something sacred. Inside there was a contract, a set of documents with legal language that made her stomach churn. and a photograph clipped to the corner. That was the first time she saw his face. Nathaniel looked exactly like someone who made decisions without blinking. Dark suit, silver cufflinks, eyes as cold as polished stone. He had the kind of presence that demanded silence, not by intimidation, but by absolute certainty. She stared at the photo for minutes, hoping to feel something. Fear, anger, hope, but all she felt was emptiness. He didn't look cruel, just uninterested. The kind of man who had already planned the next 10 years of his life and saw marriage not as partnership, but as structure. The contract specified that the marriage would last a minimum of 1 year. After that, either party could end it without penalty. In return for her cooperation, all of her family's debts would be erased and she would receive a monthly allowance, enough to support herself comfortably. But comfort was not what she craved. She wanted agency, freedom, love. None of that was listed in the fine print. Her father told her that Nathaniel's lawyer had already made arrangements for her to travel to New York in 5 days. There would be no engagement, no slow build-up. The wedding was scheduled for the following week, a private civil ceremony, no guests, no celebration. Just a signature, a ring, and a year. Emily sat in silence as her father tried to explain the terms, but she wasn't listening to the words. She was watching her mother cry softly into a tissue, seeing the way her shoulders collapsed under invisible weight. Her parents had aged 10 years in the last 2, worn down by humiliation, by the loss of everything they had built. They didn't want this for her, not really, but they had chosen it all the same. And now, so had she. That night, Emily walked alone to the edge of the property. The Carter family home was surrounded by open fields and rusting fences. Under the stars, she looked up and wondered if anyone else in the world was being sold the same way she had been. She wasn't angry at her parents. Not exactly. They had made a deal with the devil, yes, but to them, Nathaniel wasn't the devil. He was a lifeline. The days passed in a blur. People in town noticed her sudden absence from the diner, but said nothing. Everyone knew the Carters were drowning. Whispers followed her through the aisles of the local market, through the church steps on Sunday morning, through the dust that settled on her shoes as she walked the streets for the last time. She didn't bother correcting them. Whatever story they told would be better than the truth. On the morning of her departure, she stood by the doorway with a small suitcase and a jacket too thin for New York. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering blessings and apologies into her hair. Her father simply nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Emily stepped into the black sedan sent by Nathaniel's team and didn't look back. The drive to the airport felt like hours stretched by silence. The driver didn't speak. Emily didn't either. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching the Texas landscape blur into nothingness. At the airport, she was handed a first-class ticket and escorted through security by a woman named Denise, who introduced herself as Nathaniel's personal assistant. Denise was polite, efficient, and utterly detached. She spoke with the precision of someone trained to manage crisis without emotion. "You will be met at the airport in New York. You'll be staying at Mr. Reed's secondary property until after the ceremony. Once the marriage is formalized, you'll move into the primary residence." Emily wanted to ask what kind of man had multiple residences in Manhattan, but she didn't. She nodded, thanked her, and boarded the plane. The flight was surreal. She had never flown before. The polished interior, the champagne offered, and declined the leather seats. It all felt borrowed from someone else's life. She tried to read the book she had brought, but her eyes kept drifting to the contract in her lap, her signature already etched into the bottom line. When the plane landed at John F. Kennedy Airport, it was evening. Lights twinkled across the skyline like a promise half kept. Another driver waited at the terminal with her name on a sign. He took her to a high-rise apartment in the Upper East Side, where a silent doorman led her into an elevator and pressed the top floor. The apartment was quiet, sleek, and cold. A woman in her 40s greeted her with a clipboard and a distant smile. "Ms. Carter, I'm Helen, the house manager. This will be your temporary residence until next week. Mr. Reed will meet you for dinner on Friday." That gave her 4 days to sit in a space designed for someone who never stayed long. The walls were bare, the furniture modern and expressionless. Every surface gleamed. There was no warmth, no personal touch, just function. Emily wandered from room to room, trying to feel something. The bedroom was enormous, the view breathtaking, the silence oppressive. She unpacked slowly, placing her few clothes in drawers carved from polished mahogany. She ran her fingers over the countertop in the kitchen, opened cabinets full of unused dishes, and finally collapsed onto the edge of the bed. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the face from the photograph, imagining what kind of man she would be expected to call her husband. Nathaniel Reed, investor, businessman, negotiator, a man who bought a marriage like he bought property. And somewhere between night and morning, Emily began to understand that whatever version of her life she had planned in Texas was gone. New York wasn't a fresh start. It was a transaction wrapped in silk and glass. The name Nathaniel Reed would not just change her life, it would erase the one she thought she had. The day Emily was to meet Nathaniel Reed began in silence. The apartment where she had been staying for the past 4 days remained impersonal, sterile, and indifferent to her presence. She had walked its every hallway, stared out its towering windows at the sprawling city below, and tried to imagine herself part of it. But everything about the place whispered that she was only a guest. Even the air felt borrowed. That morning, Helen, the house manager, entered the apartment at precisely 9 o'clock, as always, her clipboard tucked under her arm and her tone sharp with precision. "Mr. Reed will meet you for dinner this evening. The car will arrive at 7. You'll be dining at his primary residence." Emily nodded without speaking, her chest tight. It was not fear that gripped her. It was the anticipation of stepping into the life that had been written for her, without her voice. She spent the rest of the day sitting by the tall windows, watching taxis blur past below, wondering what kind of man expected a wife to arrive like a package, pre-approved and already signed for. When 7 o'clock arrived, she stepped into a different black sedan, this one even more polished than the first. The driver offered no words, only opened the door for her and closed it behind her with the same sterile efficiency she had begun to associate with Nathaniel's world. The city moved around her in waves of light and sound, but inside the car it was silent, cocooned, untouched by the noise outside. The Reed estate was not a home. It was a fortress carved from stone and steel, tucked behind gates that buzzed open upon arrival and closed again with finality. The building stood tall among manicured hedges and sleek black cars, with a doorman who bowed without emotion and a foyer that gleamed like it had never been lived in. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and chandeliers that looked like constellations, suspended mid-air, greeted her as she entered. A butler escorted her into a dining room where a long table stretched further than necessary, set perfectly for 2 at one end. A single white orchid sat in the center of the table, tall and silent. She took her seat and waited. It was exactly 7:30 when Nathaniel Reed walked in. He wore a dark suit, no tie, shirt crisp and open at the collar. His presence was immediate. Not just because of his height or the deliberate way he moved, but because of the silence that followed him, like a shadow that bent the atmosphere to his will. His eyes met hers without hesitation. No curiosity, no awkwardness, just a measured assessment, like a man confirming an order had arrived as expected. "Emily," he said, his voice deep and composed, but not unkind. "Nathaniel," she replied, forcing her voice to stay steady. He extended his hand. She shook it. "You received the documents," he said, not as a question but a statement. "Yes, I read them." "And you agreed?" "I signed them." A pause, a slight nod from him. Then he took his seat, and the butler entered with the first course. The meal was precise, like everything else in his world. Dishes came and went with quiet efficiency, each one plated like a work of art, each one barely touched. Emily barely tasted the food. She watched him, tried to read him. He ate slowly, methodically, like a man used to control. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and looked at her with unflinching clarity. "I assume you understand the terms," he said. "This arrangement is not romantic, it is not personal. It is transactional. You will be provided for. You will be respected, but I do not expect nor intend affection." Emily's fingers tightened around her glass. "Then why a marriage?" He leaned back, not defensive, just firm. "Because it simplifies matters. The public assumes stability, investors see reliability, and legally, it offers certain advantages." "And you've done this before." That caught him off guard for a fraction of a second. His jaw tensed, then relaxed. "Not in the same way," he replied. "Permanence, neither does this. But I've made similar agreements. None of them required she let that settle in. It confirmed what she had suspected from the moment she read the contract. Nathaniel, Reed did not believe in connection. He believed in order. She was not a partner, she was a solution. "There are rules," he continued. "You'll have access to the house, a private wing, staff. You'll be expected to attend certain events. In public, we will act accordingly. In private, I will respect your space, and I expect the same." Emily nodded. "And after 1 year, the marriage dissolves. You'll receive a final payment if you choose to accept it, and all ties will end, unless mutually decided. Otherwise," that line hung in the air, deliberately vague, a safety net wrapped in business terms. "Why me?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Because you were willing." That answer landed harder than any she had prepared for. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even cold. It was honest, brutally so. And in its simplicity, it told her everything about the man sitting across from her. The rest of the dinner passed, without further revelations. The conversation drifted into logistics, travel, schedule, press. Nathaniel treated it like any merger, efficient, structured, devoid of emotion. When the final course was cleared, he rose and extended his hand again. "We will be married next Tuesday, civil ceremony discreet. My legal team will manage everything." She took his hand and stood, meeting his eyes again. "I'll be there." "I know." A car waited outside to take her back to the temporary apartment. As she sat in the back seat, city lights flashing across the glass, Emily felt the weight of finality settle on her shoulders. The decision had been made days ago, but now it had a face, a voice, a presence that made her breath catch without warning. Nathaniel Reed was not cruel. He was not charming. He was not romantic. He was a machine disguised as a man, and she was about to become the most calculated decision of his career. The mansion stood like a monument to silence, tall and magnificent. On the outskirts of Manhattan, surrounded by iron gates and guarded by technology that whispered of secrets. On the morning following the private wedding ceremony, Emily Carter became Emily Reed, at least in name, and was driven from the courthouse to what was now referred to as her home. The ceremony itself had been swift and impersonal, witnessed only by lawyers and assistants. There had been no music, no vows spoken beyond the legally required words. The ring slid onto her finger like the final stroke of a signature. Now the car slowed to a stop before a vast black gate. It opened with a quiet hum, revealing a long driveway lined with trees trimmed too perfectly. The house, or rather, the estate, rose in the distance like a painting rendered in shades of grey and steel. It was beautiful in the way a sculpture is beautiful, cold, distant, untouchable. Emily stepped out of the car and onto the slate stone path that led to the front door. Helen, the house manager, was already waiting for her. "Welcome, Mrs. Reed," she said, with the same polite detachment as before. "On business, but will return tomorrow evening." "Mr. Reed is away." Emily only nodded, the weight of her new name still foreign on her shoulders. Helen led her through the double doors, and the world shifted. Inside, the mansion opened like a cathedral, tall ceilings, walls of glass, polished, floors that reflected the massive chandeliers above. Every piece of furniture seemed chosen for symmetry rather than comfort. Art hung on the walls, abstract and expensive, but none of it told a story. None of it felt lived in. "This wing is yours," Helen said, gesturing toward a hallway that stretched toward the back of the house. "You'll find your room, personal, study, and private terrace there. The house operates with full staff, though most remain behind the scenes. Meals are prepared daily, and your schedule will be communicated to you via the digital panel in your suite. Emily followed her down the hall, trying not to let the sheer size of the place overwhelm her. The floor beneath her feet was heated, the lighting adjusted automatically to the time of day, and every door opened with a gentle touch. It was also perfectly engineered that she felt like a guest in a high-end hotel rather than a wife entering her marital home. Her room was a blend of soft tones and silent technology. A king-sized bed, untouched, walls of frosted glass, a walk-in, closet filled with clothing she hadn't picked out. Everything fit perfectly, her measurements clearly taken and handed off without her consent. A stylist had curated her new wardrobe to reflect a woman who belonged beside Nathaniel Reed. Expensive, elegant, invisible. That first night, Emily stood on the terrace and looked out over the city lights in the distance. The wind was sharp against her skin, and for a moment she imagined herself back in Texas, sitting on her porch with her knees drawn up and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Back when her life was small, but still hers. She didn't sleep. Well, the bed was too perfect, the silence too absolute. She kept expecting to hear footsteps, to feel the presence of someone nearby, but there was nothing. Only the sound of her own breath and the occasional mechanical sigh of the central system adjusting the temperature. At some point in the early morning, she rose from bed and wandered the halls barefoot. Every corridor looked like the last. Every door was closed. The house felt less like a home and more like a museum of someone else's life. At breakfast, Helen informed her that Mr. Reed would be returning for dinner. Emily asked where he had gone, and the answer was simple: Chicago. Business, no elaboration. It seemed Nathaniel's life existed in spreadsheets and flight itineraries, never pausing long enough to consider the human aspects of the world he moved through. Later that day, Emily attempted to explore the mansion on her own. Most of the rooms were unlocked, though impersonal. A library lined with untouched books. A music room with a grand piano, covered and clearly unused. A glass-walled gym. Every space was pristine, unlived, like a showroom frozen in time. She wandered deeper, hoping to find a glimpse of something, anything, that hinted at the man she had married. In one hallway, she found herself in front of a door that didn't open. It looked no different from the others, but the handle didn't turn, and there was no keypad like the rest. It was locked, deliberately so. She paused there longer than she intended, her hand resting on the cool brass. "Some rooms are restricted," said a voice behind her. She turned. Sarah, one of the house staff, stood a few steps away. She was older than Helen, with tired eyes and a tight expression. She didn't smile. "Why is this one locked?" Emily asked. Sarah hesitated. "It's not my place to say. Mr. Reed values privacy." Emily nodded, though the curiosity dug deeper inside her. Sarah turned and walked away, and Emily remained, there staring at the door that seemed to hum with secrets. That evening, Nathaniel returned. He greeted her in the main living room, still wearing the same calm detachment as before. He asked if she had settled in, if the accommodations met her expectations. She replied that they had. He nodded, then informed her they would attend a gala in 2 weeks, a charity event that required them to appear together. "You'll be introduced as my wife," he said. "Maintain appearances. Certain assumptions will be made. It's important she didn't argue. She simply asked what was expected of her. Grace, poise, discretion." Emily smiled thinly. "Like furniture." His expression didn't change. "If that's what helps you process this, then yes." Dinner was brief and quiet. He sat across from her, but they didn't speak beyond necessity. He asked about her education, and she told him she hadn't started college, that she had wanted to study journalism. He nodded and said nothing more. Afterward, he retreated to his study, a room she hadn't yet seen. The door closed behind him, and once again, she was alone. As she walked back to her suite that night, she passed the locked door again. Something about it unsettled her, not because of what might be inside, but because it was the only place in the house that seemed to matter. She stopped just briefly and placed her hand on the wood. It was cold beneath her fingers. She didn't press or knock. She simply stood there. Because for all the rooms she had walked through that day, This was the only one that felt alive. It was her first night as Mrs. Reed, and already she felt like a ghost haunting someone else's past. Days passed in slow, meticulous order within the walls of the Reed mansion. Each morning, Emily awoke in silence, dressed in clothes she hadn't chosen, and moved through rooms that mirrored one another in their perfection and emptiness. Nathaniel remained distant, present only in fragments. He dined with her on occasion, always with precision and polite formality, as if each interaction were part of a checklist. In public, they were a couple, polished and poised. In private, they were strangers occupying parallel spaces under the same roof. It was during one of her solitary wanderings that Emily found herself once again drawn toward the corridor at the far end of the east wing. The hallway was quieter than the rest, the air cooler and the lighting dimmer, as if the space itself wished to remain unnoticed. The locked door stood as it always had, unchanged. But that day, curiosity overcame her hesitation. She examined the frame closely, noticed the faint marks of wear around the handle, and saw the faintest shimmer of dust disturbed beneath the door's edge. Later that evening, when the household staff was scarce and Nathaniel had retreated into his private study, Emily returned with a paperclip. It was a childish plan, one she had never imagined herself carrying out, but something about that door had become impossible to ignore. She worked at the lock with fumbling fingers, the silence of the house amplifying every tiny sound, until finally, with a soft click, the door gave way. Inside, the air was heavier. The scent was not unpleasant, but it was different, softer, dustier, older. The room was dim, lit only by the city glow leaking through thick curtains. She stepped inside, slow and careful, and what she found stopped her breath. It was a bedroom, not like the ones in use. This one bore signs of abandonment. The sheets were still made but slightly rumpled, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. On the vanity stood a bottle of perfume, a silver brush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles, and a framed photograph of a young woman smiling beside Nathaniel. The woman's hair was long and chestnut, her features soft and kind. Nathaniel looked younger, more open, though his smile even then was faint and reserved. Emily stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the closet across the room. It was half open. Inside hung a series of dresses, elegant but personal, the kind one wears when they believe they are loved. She reached for the one in front, a navy blue gown, delicate and clearly worn more than once. As she touched the fabric, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic at the bottom of the closet. Kneeling, she discovered a small box pushed to the side. Inside it were photographs, handwritten notes, and a folded piece of ivory fabric. She pulled it out. A wedding dress. Simple, understated, but undeniably bridal. Not like the one she had, worn to the courthouse. This one had been chosen with care, with feeling. Emily held it against herself, imagined the woman who had worn it or had planned to. Something shifted in her chest, an ache that had no name yet. The photograph from the vanity was now lying on the floor where she had accidentally knocked. She picked it up again and turned it over. Written in neat cursive were two words, Claire Bennett. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The name echoed through her thoughts like a haunting melody. Claire, a name Nathaniel had never spoken. A room that had been locked away, untouched but not forgotten. Someone who had once stood where she now stood. Someone who had worn the dress that had been carefully preserved. Someone who had smiled beside a man who now treated his wife as a formality. At breakfast the next morning, Nathaniel appeared more tense than usual. He asked about her plans for the day. She replied she would be reading in the library. He nodded but didn't press further. She watched him closely, wondering how many other locked doors he carried inside him. She didn't mention the room, not yet. The air between them felt too fragile, too easily shattered. Later she tried to bring it up with Sarah, the quiet housekeeper who seemed to know more than she ever said. Emily caught her alone in the pantry and approached cautiously. "Sarah," she said, voice low. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah turned from the shelves, her face unreadable. "Who is Claire Bennett?" The shift in her posture was instant. The muscles in her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "I don't know who that is," she replied too quickly. I saw her picture, Emily continued. Sarah's hands tightened around the edge of the shelf. Why? It's not my place to say. Was she Nathaniel's wife? In one of the rooms, it looked like she lived here. That room is not meant to be opened. Sarah hesitated, then looked over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. When she turned back, her voice was almost a whisper. She was supposed to be. That was all she said before she turned and left, her steps swift, her back rigid. Emily remained in the pantry, holding on to those 4 words like they were a key. Claire had been here. She had prepared for a life that never happened. And Nathaniel, whatever role he had played, had chosen to seal her memory behind a locked door rather than speak her name. That evening, Emily stood at the far end of the terrace, the city lights reflecting off the glass rail. She watched the dark sky and wondered what had happened to Claire, why she had left or if she had left at all. Nathaniel passed behind her once, said nothing, continued on his way. He didn't ask what she was thinking, he never did. Inside her suite, Emily opened her journal. The one thing that still felt hers. She wrote the name at the top of the page. Claire Bennett. Below it she wrote everything she had seen in the room, the dress, the photograph, the perfume. She drew a map of the closet, of where the box had been hidden. She sketched the handwriting from the back of the photo. She wrote questions, dozens of them, with no answers. Why was the room still untouched? Why had Nathaniel never mentioned her? And most of all, what had happened to the woman who had once worn a dress filled with hope? As she closed the journal, she realized the walls of this mansion were not just stone and glass. They were built from silence, layer upon layer of it wrapped around secrets sealed behind doors. But Emily had found the first crack, and she wasn't going to look away. The days following Emily's discovery of Claire's room unfolded like a quiet storm within her. She went through the motions of life inside the mansion with the same outward composure as before, but something had changed beneath the surface. Her mind was no longer lulled into submission by routine. It was racing, questioning, peeling back the layers of silence Nathaniel had so carefully placed around his life. She found herself glancing at him during their rare shared meals, searching his face for signs of guilt, grief, regret, anything that would betray a flicker of truth. He gave her nothing. That Thursday, Nathaniel invited her to a small charity event, a cocktail fundraiser for a hospital wing he had financed. As always, the invitation was framed as an expectation. She was to be introduced as his wife, appropriately dressed and adequately briefed on what to say and what not to mention. A stylist arrived earlier that day with a new evening gown, emerald, green and tailored with the same mechanical precision that had become the standard. She stood before the mirror in her suite, the dress hugging her body with perfect detachment, and wondered what Claire would have looked like at an event like this, whether she too had been fitted and paraded like a symbol of wealth and stability. The event was held in a private venue on the Upper West Side, minimalist in design, maximalist in wealth. They arrived as the photographers snapped pictures from a respectful distance. Nathaniel kept one hand on her lower back, always polite, never personal. He introduced her with effortless charm, each smile calculated, each interaction rehearsed. Emily smiled when expected, nodded when appropriate, and let herself disappear into the role she had been chosen to play. But something shifted midway through the evening. Emily stepped away to catch her breath in a quiet corner of the venue, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the dark skyline. As she stood there, drink in hand, she overheard a conversation between 2 men standing just a few steps away. They didn't notice her presence. "I still can't believe he's doing it again," one said with a soft chuckle. Well, he needed to. After Claire, his reputation nearly tanked. True, but it's still a hell of a move. Marrying for appearances, cutting the same deal all over again. Man's got nerves of steel. Emily didn't move. She barely breathed. The 2 men changed the subject after that, but their words echoed louder than anything else in the room. After Claire, they had spoken of her like an event, like a business disruption, like a complication that needed to be resolved. And Nathaniel, he hadn't just buried her memory. He had replaced her with another arrangement, another contract, another woman to stand beside him, smiling and silent. When they returned to the mansion, Emily didn't speak. She stepped out of the car, walked ahead of Nathaniel, and ascended the stairs without waiting. He didn't follow her. Or if he did, she didn't notice. Her thoughts were louder than any sound his footsteps could make. That night she didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of her suite with the journal in her lap and added everything she had just heard. By the next morning, something inside her had solidified. Emily no longer cared about playing the obedient role. She needed to know the truth. She needed to understand who Claire had been, not just for herself, but because she could feel the shadow of that woman pressing against the walls of the mansion, lingering in the silence, watching. There was a story here buried beneath Nathaniel's polished surface, and Emily had decided it would not remain buried. She returned to the locked room that afternoon. This time she entered without hesitation. The air was the same, still and heavy, but now it felt different. She wasn't trespassing anymore, she was seeking. She opened the drawers of the vanity. Inside were neatly arranged pieces of jewelry, untouched. She opened the closet again, ran her hand along the fabric of each dress, searched the shelves. On the top shelf, behind a stack of shoeboxes, she found a small notebook bound in leather. Claire's handwriting was delicate and slanted, the ink faded but legible. The notebook was a journal, fragmented, emotional, intimate. The entries were not dated, but their sequence revealed a pattern. Claire had once been hopeful, even excited. She had written about meeting Nathaniel, about the promise of a life together, about moving into the mansion and dreaming of something real. But slowly the tone of the entries shifted. They grew shorter, sharper. Words like cold, lonely, and claustrophobic began to appear. He says, "The marriage is for the cameras." But I believed it could be more. Sometimes I think he forgets I exist. I found another clause in the contract today, one I never noticed before. The final entries were harder to read. The ink was smudged in places, as if tears had touched the paper. I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I ever really mattered. He doesn't want a wife, he wants a mirror. Emily closed the journal gently, her chest tight. She held it in her lap for a long time before hiding it beneath her own mattress, where no one else would find it. That evening, when Nathaniel returned from the office, she was waiting in the main hallway. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice even but laced with quiet tension. He paused, his coat still on. "Now?" "Yes." He followed her to the sitting room, and she closed the door behind them. The silence stretched. Nathaniel watched her carefully, as if bracing for impact. "I found Claire's room," Emily said. She watched the flicker in his expression, the brief tightening of his jaw before he masked it with his usual composure. "I see. I read her journal." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, stepped away, walked toward the fireplace, though there was no fire. That room was supposed to remain closed. "Why?" Emily asked. "So no one would remember her?" He didn't respond right away. When he turned, his face was distant but not indifferent. "She left her," he said quietly. "Days before the wedding, without explanation, without a word. My name was dragged through speculation and headlines. Investors questioned my judgment. I learned to separate emotion from necessity." "That's how you justify this?" Emily asked. "By calling it necessity?" Nathaniel looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she saw something behind his carefully guarded expression. Not just control, but loss, shame, maybe even pain. "I made mistakes," he said. "Them. But everything I've done since was to ensure I wouldn't repeat." "You already have," Emily whispered. She left him there, standing alone in the sitting room with the ghosts of his past. She didn't wait for an apology. She didn't expect one. But that night, as she lay awake with Claire's journal hidden beneath her bed, she knew something had cracked. And once a crack appears, it never truly disappears. It only grows. The silence between Emily and Nathaniel had shifted. It was no longer the deliberate, structured quiet of two strangers upholding a contract, but something more unsettled. A silence filled with unspoken truths and the weight of the past. After her confrontation with him, nothing was explicitly said. Yet, something changed. The distance he had maintained with flawless discipline began to erode, not with grand gestures or emotional revelations, but with subtleties, small fractures in the armor. The next morning, when Emily entered the dining room, she found her favorite, breakfast waiting. Not the sterile spread usually laid out by staff, but something familiar. Scrambled eggs the way she liked them, black coffee slightly sweetened, toast browned just right. There was no note, no explanation. Nathaniel wasn't there. But it was the first time in weeks that anything in the mansion had felt intentionally hers. Later that day, Helen approached her with a message. "Mr. Reed asked me to inform you that he has arranged a meeting at Columbia University. There's an opening in their continuing education program for journalism. If you're interested, they'll be expecting you this Friday." Emily was stunned. She hadn't spoken of journalism again since that one evening weeks ago. It had seemed pointless to discuss dreams in a place built on terms and conditions, but he had remembered. He had listened. And more than that, he had acted. She didn't know what to make of it. Was it guilt? An attempt to placate her after she uncovered the truth about Claire? Or was it something else entirely? On Friday, she visited the university. It was a cold, bright day, and for the first time since arriving, in New York, she moved through the city without a driver or a script. The campus buzzed with energy. Students rushed between buildings, their arms filled with books and coffee cups, laughter trailing behind them. Emily walked through the corridors of the journalism department with a strange flutter in her chest. It wasn't quite hope, but it was near enough to taste. The admissions officer welcomed her warmly. "Mr. Reed said you might be joining us. We've reviewed your academic history and the essay you submitted. Very compelling, by the way." Emily blinked. "Essay?" He smiled, handed her a printed document. It was her writing. The journal entry she had penned weeks ago about feeling invisible inside a house full of windows and mirrors. A raw personal piece. She didn't know how Nathaniel had found it, but he had, and he had sent it. By the time she returned to the mansion that evening, the city outside had softened into twilight. She walked through the front doors with her coat still buttoned, cheeks flushed from the cold and heart unsteady with questions. Nathaniel was in the library, seated by the fire, a book in his hand. He looked up when she entered. "I visited the university," she said. "I know." She sat across from him, the heat from the fire warming the space between them. "You sent them something I wrote. I thought it was honest and well written." Emily studied him, the man she had married under a contract and shared a house with for weeks, yet knew so little about. And in that moment, he didn't look like a calculated businessman. He looked like someone trying to atone for something he couldn't name. "You're different from how you were in the beginning," she said quietly. "I'm trying," he replied, "but I don't know how to do this the way other people do." "Why not?" He closed the book, his fingers resting on the cover. "Because I built my life around control, around keeping things from falling apart. Claire was an exception. I thought I could build something with her. When she left, I stopped believing in emotion as a safe investment." Emily didn't speak. She understood more than he realized. She too had learned to armor herself with practicality. Love, for both of them, had become a dangerous indulgence. "I never meant to erase her," he added, "but I couldn't face the version of myself that failed." Emily stood and walked toward the fire. She stared into the flames, letting their warmth thaw the cold corners inside her. "Claire didn't leave because you failed her," she said. "She left because she felt unseen. And now you're doing it again, only better disguised." Nathaniel looked up at her, eyes more human than she'd ever seen. "I don't want to repeat my past," he said, "and I don't want to fail you." The silence that followed was no longer a wall, it was a bridge. That night, Nathaniel didn't retreat to his study. Instead, he sat beside her on the library couch and they talked. Not about contracts or events or public appearances, but about simple things. She told him about her childhood in Texas, about falling asleep to the sound of cicadas, and dreaming of writing stories that would matter. He told her about growing up in a house where success was the only language spoken, where failure was a foreign word and emotion a liability. Their words filled the space between them like puzzle pieces, slowly finding their place. And for the first time, Emily felt the weight of her title, Mrs. Reed, shift from burden to possibility. In the days that followed, Nathaniel's gestures became more intentional. He asked about her classes, recommended books, sat beside her as she studied in the library. Once, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't define, something soft, almost reverent. She didn't ask what it meant. She wasn't ready, neither was he. But the walls were no longer impenetrable. One morning, she woke to find a note slipped under her door. It wasn't typed or signed with initials, just a line written in Nathaniel's hand. "You are not invisible to me." She read it again and again until she could recite it without looking. And when she passed him later in the hallway, he only nodded, a flicker of something in his eyes that made her heart skip. They were still bound by an agreement, still walking a path shaped by decisions made out of necessity. But now there were footprints beside hers, real ones, human ones. And for the first time since stepping into the mansion, Emily began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. The gala was held at the penthouse of a 5-star hotel in Midtown, a place where glass and chrome replaced warmth, where chandeliers glistened like frozen fire and voices never rose above the polite murmur of high society. Emily arrived on Nathaniel's arm, dressed in a silver gown chosen by one of his stylists, every thread of it stitched for elegance, not comfort. The car ride there had been quiet, though not uncomfortable. Nathaniel had asked if she was prepared. She had answered, yes. What neither of them said was that this event, like many before it, was not about them at all. It was about being seen, performing a role, and maintaining the illusion of a perfect union. Inside the ballroom, faces turned. People offered their greetings, their compliments, their practiced smiles. Nathaniel slipped into his element with ease, shaking hands, discussing investments, speaking the fluent, heartless language of money and influence. Emily stayed close, playing her part. She smiled when expected, listened carefully, and nodded in rhythm with conversations she didn't feel part of. But the illusion began to unravel when she stepped away to catch her breath. The ballroom had a mezzanine level with a view of the glittering city below, and it was there, beneath soft jazz and polished laughter, that she paused. Below, Nathaniel was engaged in conversation with 2 men in suits. From her angle, she couldn't see their faces clearly, but she recognized one of them from earlier headlines. A business partner known for bold acquisitions and bolder rumors. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. The music faded slightly, the murmur below rising just enough to catch a few words, spoken in a voice that carried a little too far. "Of course," she agreed, the man said. "Names for half that. A contract like that? Most women would sign away there." Nathaniel's voice was quieter, but she caught the response. It was never about money for her. "She's still an asset, Nate. You needed someone who wouldn't make waves. She's perfect for that. Low profile, obedient, pretty, just enough story for the press to stay interested." Emily's breath caught. She didn't move. She waited for Nathaniel to say something, to correct him, to push back. But all he said was, "She knows the terms." The words echoed in her ears. She stepped back from the railing, the dress suddenly tighter around her ribs. Her hands were cold, her stomach hollow. Back inside the ballroom, she forced herself to move among the guests again. When Nathaniel found her later, she smiled. She let him place his hand on her back, let him guide her through the rest of the evening as if nothing had changed. But something had. The invisible thread of connection she had started to believe in had frayed, not just from what she heard, but from what he didn't say. They returned to the mansion just after midnight. Nathaniel walked beside her through the main hall, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the shift in her mood. When they reached the staircase, she stopped. "I need to ask you something," she said. He turned, the edge of fatigue in his expression. "Of course." "At the event tonight, your partner, he called me an asset, said I was obedient, that I was useful for appearances, and you didn't correct him." Nathaniel's silence stretched too long. "Emily," he began, voice steady, "you know what this arrangement was from the beginning." "That's not the point." she said, trying to keep her voice even. "The point is that I've changed. I'm not the same person who signed that contract. And I thought maybe you weren't either." Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes shadowed, unreadable. "It's not that simple." "It is," she said. "It's as simple as respect." He didn't respond, and that silence, more than the words of any business partner, became the loudest confirmation she needed. That night, she didn't sleep in her own bed. She returned to Claire's room, sat on the edge of the old vanity, and stared at her reflection in the dusty mirror. It was the first time she admitted to herself how deeply she had wanted it to be real. Not the contract, not the money, but the possibility of something honest beneath it all. Nathaniel had opened just enough of himself to make her believe in it, and now, with a few careless words and one moment of indifference, he had closed that door again. The following morning, she requested a meeting with her lawyer. She asked him to review the termination clause of the contract. According to the terms, she could request an exit after 6 months with no penalty if she could prove emotional or psychological distress. The clause was there as a safeguard, a concession added by Nathaniel's legal team. At the time, it had seemed unnecessary. Now it felt like her only escape. Nathaniel noticed the shift in her. He didn't ask directly, but the air between them changed. He approached her one evening in the study where she was reading through her coursework. "You've been distant," he said. "I've been thinking," she replied. "About leaving?" "Yes." He didn't try to stop her. He nodded once, as if the conversation were about a cancelled appointment, not a disintegrating relationship. "If that's your choice," and he said, "I won't fight it. I know you won't." She closed the book and stood. "But that's the problem, Nathaniel. You never fight for anything that matters. You only preserve what you can control." He looked down, hands clasped loosely in front of him, something without losing it. "And what if I don't know how to fight for?" Emily stepped closer. "Then maybe you never deserved it to begin with." In the following days, she made preparations. She didn't announce anything. She continued attending her classes, continued walking the halls of the mansion, but her heart was no longer anchored there. Every room felt like a box, every exchange a performance. Then, 3 days before she was scheduled to leave, something unexpected happened. A package arrived for her, hand-delivered by a courier, no return address. Inside was a sealed envelope and a stack of documents. The envelope bore her name in Nathaniel's handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten, not typed. The words were simple, careful, and real. "Emily, I won't ask you to stay. You never should have been placed in a position where leaving was your only way to be seen. I created a world where control mattered more than truth, and I'm sorry. This isn't another contract, it's a release, the official termination. You are free to go, no conditions, no penalties, no silence required. But also enclosed is something else, a beginning, not an end. If you choose to stay, not as a wife under contract, but as a woman with agency, I will be here, not for the cameras, not for the business, for you. If you leave, I will understand. If you return, it will be your decision. For once, the next step will not be mine to make." Emily read it once, then again. Her heart ached with every line, not because it hurt, but because it was the first thing he had given her that wasn't calculated. It was raw, and it was real. She stood by the window, letter in hand. The city stretched before her. For the first time, her decision would not be bound by desperation or debt or duty. It would be hers, fully and finally. Emily left the mansion before dawn, the streets still wrapped in the silence of early morning. The city not yet awake. Nathaniel's letter remained in her coat pocket, its presence a weight both comforting and uncertain. She had not decided what to do. Not yet. But she knew she needed distance, time, a breath that belonged entirely to her. She took a small apartment on the Lower East Side, modest and cluttered, the polar opposite of the sterile luxury she had grown used to. The walls were chipped, the floor creaked, and the shower took 5 full minutes to warm up. But it was hers. For the first time in months, she slept in a space she had chosen, without surveillance, without expectations. Classes resumed, and Emily threw herself into her coursework. She met other students, sat in cafes to write, started a blog that slowly gained traction. Her voice, once buried under obligation and fear, began to stretch and rise again. But at night, in the quiet of her new apartment, the letter called to her. Not just Nathaniel's, but Claire's. Claire's journal had never left her side. It traveled with her, hidden in a canvas bag, pages worn from rereading. Emily began to see echoes of herself in the woman who had once lived in that locked room. The hope, the unraveling, the realization that love without recognition is not love at all. But it wasn't just their shared experience that haunted her. It was the ending that had no closure. Claire had disappeared, her name erased from the Reed family's narrative, and Nathaniel, for all his moments of honesty, had never fully explained what happened. It was Sarah who finally opened the door to the truth. Emily returned to the mansion late one afternoon, not to stay, but to retrieve the last of her belongings. Nathaniel was not there. The staff moved with professional detachment, though their glances lingered longer now. Sarah was in the kitchen, folding linens, her movements slow and deliberate. Emily hesitated at the threshold, unsure if the silence between them could be bridged. "She used to sit right there," Sarah said suddenly without turning. "Toast." She liked the corner by the window. Every morning with tea, and Emily stepped inside, her breath catching. "Claire?" Sarah nodded for a little while. She was kind, lonely but kind. She made the house feel less like a machine. Emily approached slowly. "Why did she leave?" Sarah placed the linens down and looked at her. Really looked. Was coming for her. "I don't understand." Because she realized no one. She waited, Emily, for months. She waited for Nathaniel to see her, to love her the way she hoped he would. But the house swallowed her. Day by day, she faded. And then, one morning, she was gone. Emily's voice dropped. Gone where? No one knows. She left a note for the staff, said she was sorry, but she had to go. She didn't even leave it for him. She just vanished. Emily sat at the edge of the counter, the truth settling in her chest like dust. "She wrote letters," she said, "to herself. I read them." Sarah's eyes softened. "Then, you understand." She didn't stop feeling. She stopped being seen. There was more. Emily could feel it pressing against Sarah's silence. "There's something else, isn't there?" Sarah reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. Yellowed at the edges, tied with twine. She handed it over. "She gave this to me the day she left. Asked me to destroy it. I couldn't. I thought one day it might matter." Emily opened the envelope slowly. Inside were 3 letters, all addressed to Nathaniel, all written in Claire's careful, elegant script. Emily read the first, then the second. By the third, her hands were trembling. Claire had loved him, and she had broken because of that love. "You once looked at me like I mattered," Claire had written. "But now I am an ornament, a shadow of something you no longer wish to face. I thought if I waited, if I was patient, I might return to your line of sight. But I understand now. You do not lose people. You simply misplace them behind your ambition." Emily folded the letters back into the envelope, her heart aching. Later that evening, she returned to her apartment and sat at her desk. She stared at the city lights and began to write, not in her journal, but in a letter of her own. She didn't know if she would send it, but the words had to exist somewhere. "Nathaniel, you once told me you built your world on control. That emotion was a risk you couldn't afford. But what you never saw was that control cost you everything real. Claire didn't leave because she wanted to hurt you. She left because you stopped recognizing her humanity. And now here I am, holding pieces of her you tried to bury. I'm not angry, but I am changed. I've seen what happens when love is reduced to a contract, and I've seen what remains when someone chooses silence over vulnerability. This isn't a goodbye, but it's not a return either. I need to know who I am without your name tied to mine. I need to write stories that aren't dictated by your schedule. And you need to choose whether you want to live in a house or build a home." Emily sealed the letter and placed it in a drawer. The next morning, she published an article on her blog titled "The Cost of Silence." It didn't mention names. It didn't accuse. It told the story of a woman who agreed to a marriage born from desperation, found another woman's ghost in the attic, and decided that love without freedom is not love at all. The post spread fast. Readers connected with the honesty, the quiet, rebellion in her words. Comments poured in, messages from other women, strangers who had stood in rooms where they didn't belong, whose voices had been folded away to keep someone else's life tidy. 1 week later, a package arrived at her apartment, no sender listed. Inside was a small photograph. Claire and Nathaniel seated in the garden behind the mansion, sunlight between them, her smile soft, his arm around her in a rare, unguarded moment. On the back was a note. She mattered. I see that now. Thank you for not letting her disappear. And Emily placed the photo beside her desk. She didn't need anything else from him. Not now, not yet. But somewhere deep inside her, a new thought began to grow. Perhaps the truth, once spoken, does not shatter everything. Perhaps it plants something. And maybe, just maybe, the things that grow from honesty are stronger than anything built on silence. The wind that swept through the city that day was sharp and restless, as if the sky itself had grown impatient, with all the unsaid things lingering between Emily and Nathaniel. It had been over a week since she had left the mansion, since she had published the story that poured her truths onto digital paper for the world to read. Her blog post had found resonance far beyond what she expected, shared by strangers, quoted in interviews, and picked up by several minor publications that reached out to her for comments. She had declined all interviews, letting her words stand, alone. But among the flood of responses, only one absence mattered: Nathaniel. He had not called, had not written again, had not even acknowledged the public impact of her story. Not directly, until a message arrived in her inbox, brief, impersonal, from his assistant. Mr. Reed would like to see you. No expectations, just a conversation. Tomorrow, noon. The library. Emily read the message several times. She knew the tone wasn't his, but the request was unmistakably from him. He was reaching out, but in the only way he knew how, formally, cautiously, without presuming that forgiveness or reconciliation was already waiting for him. The next day, she dressed simply. No designer gowns, no borrowed elegance. Just a soft sweater, jeans, and boots. She walked through the city herself, refusing the offer of a car, needing to feel every block beneath her feet. When she reached the gates of the mansion, the security system recognized her still. No questions were asked. The doors opened. The house looked unchanged, but it felt different. She no longer entered as someone being absorbed by its silence. She came as someone who had stepped out of its shadow and returned by choice. Helen met her at the door with a quiet nod, then left her alone. Nathaniel waited in the library, just as promised. The fireplace was lit, casting amber light across the polished wood floors. He stood when she entered, his suit subdued, his posture less guarded than she remembered. He looked at her not as an obligation, nor as a liability. He looked at her, like someone who had been holding breath for far too long. "Thank you for coming," he said. Emily stepped forward but didn't sit yet. He folded his hands in front of him. "Why now?" "Because there's no one else left to lie to, including myself." She watched him for a long moment, then lowered herself into the chair across from him. He remained standing. "I read what you wrote," he continued. "Every word. More than once." She waited. The silence between them wasn't cruel. It was expectant. "You didn't use my name," he said. "You didn't make it about me." "It wasn't," she replied. "Not entirely." He nodded. "Still, you could have destroyed me. You didn't. It wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering who I am." Nathaniel finally sat, his shoulders sinking slightly, as if relinquishing something heavy he had been carrying too long. "I think I forgot how to see people," he said. "For years, everything I did was about preserving what I built. The company, the image, the control. After Claire left, I convinced myself that detachment was strength, that emotions were flaws, that vulnerability made people leave. And then you married me," Emily said softly. "I married a solution," he admitted. And you became the reminder that solutions aren't people. They were quiet again. Outside, wind rattled the bare trees. Inside, the fire crackled like a nervous breath. You said something once, Emily said, losing it. That you didn't know how to fight for something without... He nodded, avoided love altogether. Because when I loved Claire, I smothered it with fear. When I married you, and now... Nathaniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice lower. Present. To be flawed. To be seen. Now I'm trying to learn how to be. She studied him. The man who had bought a marriage to solve a debt, who had locked away the memory of a woman he once cared for, who had built a fortress and called it home. But also, the man who had stepped aside without argument when she chose to leave, who had sent her an honest letter without asking for anything in return, who had not erased her name but acknowledged her story. You can't undo the beginning, she said. I know. And I'm not here to fix you, and I don't expect you to. She stood then, slowly, walked toward the fireplace. Her eyes drifted to the bookcase behind him, where one volume had been pulled halfway out. Claire's favorite, she realized, recognizing the binding from the journal. He had read it again, perhaps many times. I found her letters, Emily said. The ones she wrote to you. He looked down. Them. I kept everything. I couldn't read them. After she left, I told myself they didn't matter. But I kept she loved you until the end. I know, he said, and I never said it back, not properly, not when it mattered. Emily turned to face him. What would you say now? He raised his eyes. There was no defense left in them. I would tell her she deserved to be seen, that she mattered more than any contract I ever signed. And I would tell you... He hesitated. I would tell you I see you. I saw you from the beginning. But I didn't know how to show it. Emily stepped closer. And now I'm here without terms, without expectations. If you stay, it's because you want to. If you leave, it won't be because I couldn't change. It'll be because I changed too late. She stood before him, her heart full of all the things he wasn't asking for, all the things she might choose to give, not because he demanded them, but because he had finally learned not to. I haven't decided yet, she said. I know. She turned to leave. He didn't stop her, but as she reached the door, she paused. Do you still think emotion is a liability? She asked, glancing over her shoulder. Nathaniel smiled faintly. I think it's the only part of life that can't be negotiated. Emily nodded once, then she walked away, the sound of her steps echoing through the mansion. And for the first time since she entered that house months ago, she didn't feel like a transaction. She felt like herself, whole, real, and the choice ahead would be hers alone. The city no longer felt like a stranger. In the weeks after her conversation with Nathaniel, Emily settled into her own rhythm. She attended lectures, filled notebooks with stories that now belonged only to her, and wandered the streets at night without a destination, letting the hum of life remind her she had a place in it beyond obligation. Every morning brought her closer to the end of the 6-month agreement. Though the contract had already been voided, the date still echoed in her mind like a turning point. She had imagined that when this moment came, her heart would be certain. But certainty, she found, was not always a luxury of freedom. Letters arrived from her parents, her mother's handwriting shaky but hopeful, her father's few words heavy with apology and pride. They knew what she had done, what she had endured, though not every detail. Emily had spared them the pain of knowing just how far things had gone inside that mansion. She had forgiven them in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself. After all, their decision had come from desperation, not cruelty. And yet, she had carried the weight of it alone, reshaped by the choice no one had, asked if she wanted. She still hadn't responded to Nathaniel's last message. After their meeting in the library, she returned to her apartment without making any promises. There was no ultimatum from him, no pleading, no sudden calls in the night. In his silence, there was something honest, an understanding that the next move belonged to her and that for once no contract would guide it. Her journalism professor pulled her aside after class one Thursday. I read your piece, Kimmy said, the one on silent roles. It wasn't just good, it was necessary. Emily nodded, humbled by the compliment, but too aware of what it had cost her to write it. That article had not just been a reflection of her experience, it had been a release, a quiet rebellion. A declaration that she had seen herself reduced to a function and refused to remain there. That evening, as she sat on the fire escape outside her apartment, a soft wind tugging at the corners of her notebook, a delivery arrived. No flowers, no dramatic message, just an envelope with her name on it, and beneath it, a handwritten note in Nathaniel's familiar script. "You don't owe me anything." But I owed you this. Inside the envelope was another document. Her name was there, listed not as Emily Reed, but as Emily Carter. Her legal identity had been fully restored. Bank accounts closed, any remaining ties to his estate severed. There was also a second sheet, a scholarship application already approved for a summer journalism program in London, something she had once mentioned in passing, barely a whisper of a dream. At the bottom of the form was a simple line, funded by an anonymous benefactor. She didn't need to ask who it was. The next morning she took the long way to campus, her boots striking the pavement with something between hesitation and purpose. She passed the bookstore where she and Nathaniel had once stood in silence, where she had watched him buy a biography on someone he would never allow himself to become. She passed the cafe where she wrote her first article, the one that made her feel visible again. She passed the library steps where she had once sat with Claire's journal in her bag, her future still unread. And when she reached her apartment later that day, another envelope waited at her door. This one smaller. Inside was a key, no note, no instructions. She knew what it unlocked. That evening, Emily packed a small bag, not out of impulse, but intention. She took only what she needed, left a letter for her neighbor with instructions about forwarding her mail, and boarded a train north, the letter and key tucked safely in her coat. She arrived at the mansion just after dusk. The house looked the same, grand, stoic still, but its silence no longer intimidated her. She didn't knock, she used the key. Inside, she found no staff, no flicker of controlled routine. Just the low sound of music drifting from the living room. Classical, soft, unassuming. Nathaniel stood by the window, facing the dark garden beyond the glass. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable, but not cold. "You came," he said. "I had to know if you meant it." "I did," he said. "All of it." "I didn't come to stay," she added quickly. He nodded. "I know." Emily walked toward him. She stopped a few steps away. The space between them felt lighter than before. "I still don't know what this is," she said, "or what it could be." "I don't either," Nathaniel replied, "but I'd like to find out if you'll let me." She looked around the room, so familiar, yet altered. The photographs on the walls had changed. One by the fireplace was of the garden in spring. Another was a candid photo of the Manhattan skyline, taken at dusk. She realized then that the house had begun to shift, not just in decor, but in essence. Someone had started to live here, not just exist. "I'm leaving for London in June," she said. "I know. You helped make that happen. I only did what I should have done in the beginning, support you without shaping you." Emily moved to the window beside him. Outside, the garden slept under frost and shadow. "I won't promise to return," she said. "Not yet. I won't ask you to." She turned to face him. His smile was small. "But I might write." "I'd like that." They stood in silence, the kind that didn't feel like absence. The fire crackled behind them, and somewhere in the mansion a draft stirred the curtains. "I don't want a life defined by contracts," Emily said after a long pause, "something fragile and hard-won. I want something real." "So do I," he answered. "And this time, I'll earn it." She left that night with no guarantee, no timeline, no vow, only a letter in her hand and clarity in her heart. Her decision was not a final one. It was a beginning. She had not chosen him out of need or guilt or pressure. She had chosen herself, and in doing so left the door open, not to the past, but to a future unbound. The air in London was damp with the kind of soft rain that blurred lights and softened the sharp edges of buildings. Emily stood beneath the awning of a corner cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the city breathe. It had been 2 months since she arrived, stepping off the plane with a suitcase and a heart split between memory and hope. The summer program had exceeded every expectation. Intense, challenging, filled with voices from around the world. Her days were spent writing, editing, listening. Her nights were quiet, often spent walking the narrow streets, learning the rhythm of a place that had never been hers, but didn't question her presence. For the first time in years, Emily made decisions without weighing them against someone else's expectations. She chose her clothes in the morning without wondering what Nathaniel's associates might think. She wrote stories that mattered to her, not ones that would appeal to investors or socialites. She existed without being defined by another's needs. And that, more than any location or achievement, had given her back the core of herself. Yet, even in the quiet moments, especially in the quiet moments, her thoughts drifted to New York, to the library where they had last spoken, to the garden she never saw in bloom, to the letter she had left on his desk the night she boarded her flight. In the letter, she had written that love without freedom wasn't love. That silence had cost them too much already, that if there was to be anything real between them, it had to be built on choice, not obligation. She had left no address, no return date, just her words. And yet, every week since she arrived, a letter found its way to her university mailbox. Always handwritten, always unsigned, always beginning the same way. I read something today that reminded me of you. The first had included an article clipped from a newspaper about a journalist uncovering corruption in a small town. Exactly the kind of work Emily had once dreamed of doing. The second had been a quote scribbled in the margin of a novel. Do not grow by avoiding pain, but by learning to carry it without letting it break us. The third was a memory, a description of the first time he saw her standing in the East Wing hallway, staring at the locked door. He never asked for a reply. He never tried to pull her back. He just let his presence linger at the edge of her new life, like a lighthouse on a distant shore. Then one morning, near the end of the program, she found a different kind of envelope, heavier. Inside was a single page. No clipping, no quote, just a line in his familiar handwriting. If you ever come back, it won't be to the house you left. It'll be to a home we build together, from the ground up, only if you choose it. She read it 3 times, her hands trembling not from surprise but from the confirmation of what she already sensed. He had changed, not for her but because of her absence, because being alone had forced him to face the silence he had once weaponized, because love, when not demanded, had finally taken root. Later that day, Emily walked through Hyde Park, notebook in hand. She sat beneath a tree and began to write, not to him but for herself. A letter with no destination, just a series of truths she needed to put on paper. I no longer need saving. I am not broken. I'm not a burden to be carried or a flaw to be corrected. I'm not your redemption story, but I'm willing to build something honest with someone who sees me, not as a symbol, not as a role, but as a person with dreams that stretch beyond your world. She closed the notebook. The letter would never be sent. It didn't need to be. The day before the program ended, her professor approached her. There's a publication in New York, he said. Independent, up and coming. They're looking for someone like you. Someone unafraid of telling uncomfortable truths. Emily raised an eyebrow. You recommended me? I told them you write like someone who's lived more than her age suggests. They're expecting your application. She thanked him, heart pounding. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a tether, a bridge back to the city she had once tried to escape, now offering her a new beginning. Not one imposed, but one earned. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she booked a return ticket, one way. When her plane landed in New York, the city greeted her with a different energy. It wasn't colder, just clearer. She moved through the terminal with no one waiting for her, no driver holding a sign, no assistant rushing to collect her luggage. She hailed a cab, gave the address of a hotel downtown, and spent her first night back watching the skyline from the window, wondering if Nathaniel knew she had returned. The next morning, she walked Through the city, her steps unhurried. She passed the old bookstore again, now under renovation. She passed the university, her name still on the alumni bulletin board announcing her published article. And finally, she passed the street that led to the mansion. She didn't turn down it, not yet. Instead, she sat in a nearby park, opened her laptop, and began her application for the job her professor had mentioned. In the section marked, "Why do you want to work here?" she typed. "Because stories deserve to be told with truth and dignity. Because I've lived in silence and I know how dangerous it can be. Because freedom is not just a right, it's the soil where love grows." She hit send. That afternoon she walked to the mansion. The gates were open, not wide, just enough. She didn't hesitate. She walked through the garden first. The flowers were blooming. Not the manicured perfection of months before, but wilder, fuller, more alive. A new gardener, perhaps, or maybe Nathaniel had finally learned that beauty did not require symmetry. She found him not in the library but on the back patio, seated at a small table with 2 cups of coffee. He looked up when she approached, stood slowly. No words. Just that same expression she had last seen in London, a quiet question waiting for an answer. She stepped forward. "I came back," she said. "I see that. But not for the house." "No?" She shook her head. "For the choice." He nodded once slowly. "Then let's build something that doesn't need locks or contracts." Emily reached for the cup of coffee already cooling at her place. It was just the way she liked it, and for the first time, nothing was borrowed. Nothing was scripted. It was hers. All of it. It had been 6 months since Emily returned to New York, and the city had become something new in her eyes. Not a maze of noise and concrete, not a fortress of power and isolation. It was now a place of possibility. The apartment she chose was modest, tucked above a flower shop on a quiet block in Brooklyn, its windows letting in warm morning light and the scent of lilac from below. She decorated it slowly, with pieces found at street markets and notes scribbled on her walls like poetry, fragments of thought, sketches of future articles, reminders that her voice belonged to no one but herself. Nathaniel had never stepped foot inside without an invitation. He understood now that presence was not possession. They saw each other often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for nothing more than a walk or a conversation that wandered between memory and laughter. But there was no schedule, no expectation. They were learning how to be people together without the shadows of their old roles pressing down. Emily's work at the independent publication had flourished. Her writing carried weight, not because of the name she once wore, but because it was grounded in something real. She covered stories about labor injustices, housing crises, forgotten neighborhoods. Her articles sparked conversations. People read them not because of her past, but because she asked the right questions and listened when the world answered. One day, she received an email from a national outlet offering her a long-form feature opportunity, a profile on modern transactional relationships and the blurred lines between economic survival and romantic autonomy. The editor had read her piece, The Cost of Silence, and wanted more. She accepted the assignment, but set her own terms. She wouldn't write from theory. She would write from truth. But this time, not just her own. She sat with Nathaniel one afternoon, at a quiet cafe, the smell of fresh bread weaving between their words. "I want to write about us," and she said, meeting his eyes. He didn't flinch. "Write what you need, tell it all." "I'll protect your privacy," she offered. He shook his head. "Worth telling, honestly." "Don't. If you hide, you hide the truth. And if this story is worth telling, it's so she wrote it. Over the span of weeks, she returned to every moment. The dinner where she first saw him as more than a stranger, the room filled with Claire's memories, the envelope that freed her. She wrote about the illusion of safety and control, about how wealth can shield a man from his own emptiness, and how a woman raised in silence can find her voice and use it to build something lasting. She didn't paint herself as a victim or him as a villain. She told the story with the honesty of someone who had seen both sides and chosen neither. The piece was published under the title, What We Build When We Are Free. It went viral. Readers flooded the comment sections with reflections, praise, arguments, stories of their own contracts. some metaphorical, others literal. Couples who had married for citizenship, women who had stayed in relationships for security, men who had used money to replace connection. And between them all, the same question pulsed like a heartbeat. What does it mean to love someone when choice is no longer compromised by necessity? Nathaniel didn't speak about the article immediately. When they next met, he handed her a copy of the magazine, its cover folded back, certain paragraphs underlined. "You told it with grace," he said, "and you didn't let me off the hook. You didn't ask me to." They sat for a while in comfortable silence, the way they now often did. Conversation between them had become less about filling space and more about honoring it. Sometimes she told him about her latest assignment. Sometimes he spoke of restructuring at his firm, of shifting power away from the boardroom and into philanthropic work. He had started a foundation quietly, in Claire's name, focused on supporting women escaping coercive financial situations. "She should be remembered for more than her leaving," he told Emily once. "She is," Emily replied, "through you, through me, through what we've built." One evening in autumn, he came to her apartment holding a brown paper bag. Inside were 2 sandwiches, a bottle of wine and a book of poetry she had mentioned wanting to read. They ate on the floor, back against the wall, the city glowing through the open windows. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said after a while, his voice quiet. Emily looked over. "I used to believe love was something you offered in exchange for certainty. That if I did enough, gave enough, I could guarantee it would stay. And now I know love is the opposite. It's what you offer without guarantee. Without bargaining. It's not safe, it's not tidy, but it's real." Emily nodded. "It's not something you buy, it's something you grow." They didn't need to say more. The space between them was full of what they had both learned. That love, when stripped of condition and control, when allowed to breathe in the light of freedom, becomes not just survivable, but sacred. That winter they moved in together, not into the mansion, but into a third space. A new apartment in the city, chosen together, furnished slowly with mismatched chairs and second-hand rugs, and a wall covered in Emily's scribbled notes. There were no staff, no assistants, just them, sometimes clumsy, often quiet, always present. On their 1-year anniversary, not of the wedding, but of the day she returned, Nathaniel handed her a box. Inside was not jewelry, not a deed or another key, it was a stack of letters. "I wrote one every week," he said, "even after you came back." She ran her fingers over the envelopes. "Why didn't you give them to me?" "Because they weren't for you to carry. They were for me to learn how to speak." She read them over the course of several days. Some were short, others pages long. They chronicled his transformation, not into someone perfect, but into someone willing, someone learning, someone who had finally stepped down from the pedestal he had built for himself and stood beside her instead. Months passed, then years, and in time people forgot how their story had begun. They saw only how it unfolded. 2 people building something not from desperation or performance, but from truth, from effort, from freedom. Emily continued to write. Nathaniel continued to listen. And when asked once during a panel how she defined love now, she said, "It's not a rescue, it's not a reward, it's not a transaction." She paused, then smiled. "It's the first time someone sees you and stays." And when she returned home that evening, there was a note waiting by the door in Nathaniel's handwriting. "I see you, I'm still here." And that always was enough.